I think perhaps a good place to start is maybe why this historical moment, maybe why now?
Well, I guess as we brought up in the lecture towards the end, part of the fascination that we encountered kind of as the more we researched about this period was that it was a very unstable time. Almost all of the research that was being done, everything that was being collected in this period was almost instantaneously discredited in the history of science. So the scientific revolution comes along, and these vast archives that have been left behind are met with really scathing distance. And so that's really interesting, because at the same time, you know, it's kind of foundational, but this serious science that came after really wanted to distance itself from that. And so it was that instability that we were really interested in as a kind of obvious reflection of the instability we experience today, not just in terms of precarity, but of really a time where we're renegotiating very, very fundamental ways that we understand the world, our position within it. These kind of things are really up for grabs at the moment. So looking into this period allowed us to deal with some of those questions, I guess. Yeah.
And in different ways, both of our previous work and research is quite engaged with, you know, all sorts of ecological processes that are going on in the contemporary world. And what was interesting to us about this period in relation to specifically that aspect is that on the one hand we can think of this as really laying the kind of violent foundation for all kinds of nature-culture separations, that all kinds of theory that everyone's been citing today is trying to undo. And yet, on the other hand, in all kinds of ways, all those distinctions were infinitely more fluid than any of our contemporary theory dares suggest, let alone, you know, convince us of, etc. The more we researched, the more it really kind of became clear, you know, how very real all kinds of boundary crossings between human, animal, plant, and mineral seemed to people at the time. And it was really interesting to us to kind of discover more about this seeming paradox of what the science at the time was laying foundations for, and what the kind of general sentiment of being immersed even in the world would have felt like, and how both of those have a strong relationship to what's going on today, precisely between like knowledge regimes and, you know, being in the world.
I think another thing is that we encounter in general a lot of fairly unquestioning, straightforward belief in science today, and it's kind of the one thing that we can maybe cling on to in a world where we can cling on to very little at the moment. And you know, as we know, it's problematic. It's as, you know, constructed as other things are, and yeah, and we wanted to kind of in a very I think like also Irid was saying something in her lecture about how research moves away from the critical and becomes kind of a reconfiguring, and that really resonated, because I think kind of looking into these strange contradictions that actually don't get resolved, and allowing them to stay in that space of contradiction and just kind of traveling along them is very much the spirit of this project. It's of course we're both critical observers of the things around us, but also I think we feel maybe certain limits to criticality, and we're more interested in the kind of strange ways that things don't add up.
And I guess again, yeah, maybe on this more positive note, the interest in looking at these kind of nuggets in the history of science that perhaps were deposed later on or soon after, is trying to see it, particularly with Western science, which has, had such anyway, whatever, we all know. But that in terms of what was spoken about this morning, how the Anthropocene can have this effect of kind of lowering morale to the point of feeling like this is the predestined kind of path, and these things will certainly take place, and there's very little to be done to reverse various processes. Looking at science non-teleologically and looking at various instances where it could have gone in all kinds of different directions is perhaps a way to recuperate a non-deterministic kind of feeling towards what awaits us in the coming decades.
Thank you so much. Maybe this is a good point. I see already an audience question up there.
Hello, thank you. I noticed when I started foraging, learning just a few basics of foraging, that there are plants that I can almost smell right now, and I can feel the texture and the stickiness. But what continually escaped me was remembering the name of the plant. And I was thinking about the idea of non-human syntax, which you brought up, like the syntax of the bacteria. And I was wondering, in some ways, all the syntaxes that escape human language. And you talked briefly about that with film syntax, and you've also touched on it now. But are there any other non-human bodies that you've engaged with that, and I think this is really important, so thank you for bringing it up, that have a syntax that is non-linguistic, that we can try to understand based on their syntax, so that we can kind of come out of the... Yes, so we can try to approach them through an understanding of their syntax. And if you can give a specific example of something non-human that you've encountered.
Can I answer? My response to that, my kind of intuitive response to that would be that syntax is exactly about doing away with an understanding of them, or some other, or at least the way that we're using it. I mean, we've talked about translating, and there is an element of translating, but maybe translating is also a bit misleading, because it's more about incorporating. So it's not saying you from this other unknown thing are now going to be incorporated into my... So that's more maybe a process of grammar or translation, which syntax somehow is doing something very, very, very different. Your story about knowing very intuitively how to smell mushroom, or I don't know, what was it? Mushrooms, maybe? Okay. But it was immediately evocative to me about how many forms of knowing and sensing have been marginalized, pushed to the periphery, or criminalized, right? Like, I mean, the forms of female contraception before modernity, all these forms of knowledge that weren't kind of directly classifiable, that were pushed away and often criminalized. That's syntax. So what's happening, I would say, in the way that you're able to smell or sense things, is that's a syntax between you and structures in the world. Those structures that are also you. So they're not other than you. They're emerging. Yeah, and so I don't. It's like I don't know how like bacteria feel. I can't talk about that, but I can. Maybe this issue of kind of sensing a rhythm and summoning a rhythm, and that kind of the thing that's not kind of objective, but that can be summoned and pushed forward, I think is very much in the spirit of this.
And it's interesting that you bring up specifically plants, because as we mentioned, the very first taxonomies existed to classify medicinal plants, just as the kind of knowledge was being developed through all kinds of, as you can imagine, possibly leading to all kinds of unpleasant side effects. for various patients before classifications emerged, but through also kind of generational knowledge of successful implementation of medicinal plants. A way to classify this so that mistakes won't be made and so that this knowledge can be kind of more broadly applied. But the names obviously don't exactly help in that precise transition from recognizing the plant and knowing how to apply it. And if in your kind of ability to recognize plants and not necessarily, you know, pick them for specific purposes, but in theory to recognize plants and know how to apply them, name is entirely bypassed, which again is about, yeah, it's about practicing rather than classifying.
Are there any more questions? Oh, Lucas has a question.
Yeah, so this beginning of your talk, where you start with this story of the periodic table, that is quite an interesting image, because on the one hand it seems, in my the way I experience that table, it has been there forever, but it's fairly recently. It's also still not a finished product. I was wondering, so on the one hand you also point to, you know, there's a time before, let's say 150 years ago. So these syntaxes then are very time sensitive in a way, right? So I was wondering, with your project, which seems to be quite rigorous, what is your aim towards the future? Like, is this a foundational new syntax proposition? Like, how far should we think of, with your syntax, how far can we go in the future before it becomes obsolete or we forget about it? Or do you have any thoughts on that? How to think about this?
I mean, for sure we're very, well, I guess that's clear, we're very interested in how all kinds of things in science that claim to describe things as they've always been and conceivably remain emerge very kind of temporally. And as we've also seen, not only with things like taxonomies of monsters, just quite extreme example that we can, you know, discredit from science in a really easy way, but all kinds of things that seem very definitive have since been disproven in the last 150 years. You know, Newtonian physics obviously hasn't been disproven, but we have gone far in practicing them. We've already kind of surpassed what they can deliver, and at the time that seemed really definitive. And I guess in our essay we discussed that in more depth, in the way that Newtonian physics is often used to legitimize all kinds of social processes metaphorically, when in fact we've kind of moved beyond that already scientifically. But in terms of kind of the future, or I guess this is just like my thought, maybe disagree, but precisely this understanding that none of this is set in stone and is kind of, yeah, open to complete change in the future with what we're proposing. We don't want to impose anything that's supposed to be definitive. And as we've kind of mentioned multiple times with syntax, and the reason that we chose that is precisely that it's something that emerges organically. And also in a different kind of way in various theories writing around the environment and inhabiting it and as part of it in the contemporary world. There's a lot of discussion of kind of doing it one step at a time and negotiating the present rather than kind of projecting an overriding narrative into the future. And so, yeah, between all those different things, I think we're more about unfolding than projecting.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as an artist, you describe the world as you see it. And I would say that this project is a reflection of our collaborative discussion about how we see the world. the more I learn, the more I see the world to exist through patterns and rhythms rather than very static things. I mean, in terms of like the consistency of science throughout history, you know, around 20 years before the periodic table emerged, you would have lost your academic career by discrediting phlogiston as the thing that's everywhere. So, you know, this is very short. This is like very short-term history. And, you know, next to that, the things, you know, I've been fascinated with for a while are kind of like, what are the things that have endured for the longest? We have things like the written word and agriculture. And these two things, any individual unit of them is nothing. Like, I mean, think of a grain of rice or a stalk of wheat. That's nothing. Any given environmental factor just like destroys that. And it's so weak. And yet this outlasts any building that we have. Or maybe that's not exactly true. But yeah, like you get the point. It's like longer. And that's fascinating. How does that, you know, or if, you know, from my understanding, with like, you know, quantum physics, like, you know, Niels Bohr kind of stopped one step short of not being able to believe in science anymore. After, you know, and his return to respecting scientific method was on the basis that science is anything that can be repeated. And at that moment, he's linked to ancient Assyrian observational practices because that's what science is in ancient Assyria. And he kind of discredits so much that happens in between, right? Like, he throws up everything that we know about Newtonian physics, and like all of that kind of goes out the window. But at the same time, he's tapped back into the oldest recorded document that we have. So that's like, so in terms of like, where does it go? Impossible to say where it goes, but it's a direct reflection of how we view the way that the world works.
Hi, I'm really excited to see your film actually, because of the way in which you're sort of disrupting a particular gaze, but also that it felt, for what I saw, I had an impression that it's pointing something back at certain institutions. I think you can be braver about that though, because what makes it into the historical record, there's a kind of undoing and a redoing of what needs to make it into that record. So although you say that, as we all know, science and its history, I think it's important to link it back to colonialism and to really like speak up and say that, especially when you have the stage. Because there's a kind of allegiance work that needs to be done, a kind of deconstructing of history, and I think it goes back to Lucas's point of how you get into the future, how we get into the future. And that requires that there is some destruction of certain narratives and recreation of others. And so I think I'm really excited to see what you make. Where can we see it?
It'll be done. We're hoping by the end of May, and then it'll be released sometime, probably in the fall or something like that.
But we're also happy to send links to any interested parties. So
in response to your question, which is a really important one, and we don't. Yeah, it's true. We negotiate this. It's not explicitly. We haven't made it a central focus, at least in this presentation. The period that we're dealing with here is kind of right before colonialism, like even kind of exploration starts. So Aldrovandi in his lifetime, I think the first ships to the
very first ships got to the West Indies, I guess not even exactly America. And what's really interesting, is that what you were going to say?
Well, what I wanted to say is, like, this particular history that we're dealing with has to do with how certain standards are established in terms of what's normal and what's not. And it, in a sense, it would feel. I'll just start with, like, I don't have a perfect answer to your question, but aside from the fact that I really respect you bringing that into the conversation, it's something that we're occupied with. So if I don't answer it perfectly, kind of, it's such a difficult question, I guess. I think we wanted to touch more. We wanted to touch kind of abstraction in terms of how, what are the processes that led to determining what is standard and what's not standard, and that has a lot of implications with the way that power structures enacted colonialism, and that is very much linked to that history. But at the same time, seemed like it would. Well, I don't know. Yeah, maybe. Can you go from there?
Maybe one just like interesting historical point that's very relevant to what you're saying is it's in Aldrovand's lifetime, and like quite well into him trying to create literally a comprehensive classification of everything that exists in the natural world.
He had 11,000 specimens, and that was the biggest collection anyone had. That was the selling point of the collection. Was it has 11,000 specimens. This is like, and he lived a long life till 85, and he thought he was going to collect everything.
And so we know now that, of course, 11,000 is not even, remotely in the ballpark of the amount of species of plants and animals that are out there. And so that this is not a practicable endeavor. But in his lifetime, and as he was quite old and was pretty pleased with his collection, the first ships get to the New World, and the first samples of plants and what have you are brought back. And him and his colleagues were completely confounded by this, and he just like completely shut it out. He was like, no, that's not. If that's the thing, then I'm never gonna succeed in my quest. So that doesn't exist.
Which many of his contemporaries would have been of, like, he was supported in that shutting because he was incredibly powerful. He was the second cousin to the Pope or something.
And like think of how the just the way that it affected those personalities then actually has implications for how those things can or cannot fit within a classification of the world more broadly. Again, there's much more to say about the film and the research around that specifically that touches on this and many other things than we could fit in here because we're trying to stay with this kind of language message trajectory. But yeah, it's a really good and a really difficult question. And also, I guess, to answer your question slightly as well, maybe in a way that we didn't, some of the other films that are to come look at much more contemporary things that are happening other than historical, and in that sense address both spatial relations and more kind of future-oriented things more directly than this project.
I guess, and I'm just also speaking intuitively from how I'm thinking right now, but and this is an open question, and we probably have to wrap up soon. So I'm kind of like maybe like leaving us with an open question. These types of knowledge regimes, we know their power, and we know their destructive force, and we know the implications that they've had throughout history. I wonder, as this open question that I in all truthfulness cannot answer, by constantly confirming this horrible power that they have, do we perpetuate the strength of that power, or rather, when we show these kind of strange inconsistencies within them, do we also unravel a bit of the force that they have. And I'm interested in any disagreement towards that, or I'm interested in that as a kind of conversation, if anyone would want to have.
And I think maybe Irit, you were saying something along with lines that works that don't perpetuate certain frameworks by inhabiting them, or something. Yeah, that's definitely something that we are invested in, and it's not an easy task, of course, but yeah.
I think. Oh, yeah.
No, just to add to this, what I find so fascinating is you say, well, in his lifetime he got around 11,000 samples or something, species. I think a recent study showed that if we statistically draw lines how we still discover new species, it takes us at least 2 more centuries before we have gotten all the life forms on Earth kind of put in shape. So it's
died.
Exactly. So on the one hand, on one hand they die off, and on the other hand we still discover them for the next 2. So, but just to, that's also why I was wondering about this new syntax. These structures, they are constantly in development. So it's also interesting just to think about that. If we are still developing in the next 200 years more speed, like how does that change our view and our mechanisms, how we structure that or how we index that? I
mean, I think it's, in our, I don't remember the exact numbers, but in our lifetimes, I think something like 80% of the spoken languages disappeared. And I would be very curious, I don't know if a study like this exists, but a parallel study of the species extinction and language extinction. And how weird is that those 2 things would somehow be even comparable, actually. That shouldn't, right? And
but then also completely not weird, precisely in response to your question there. Because, yeah, very similar forces are operating on both.
I think we should wrap up. I think the time has come. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you, Irit, as well.